Hi, it's Craig and Richard here for the feedback video for the second week of our Mindful Life course. So again, some really interesting insights, and
Yes.
and I think too one of the things is reflecting on past experience. Would have been useful to learn some of these skills earlier in life, and also how our upbringing, everything we're sort of here with is sort of a product of upbringing and so on. Past is one thing. What we're interested in from a mindfulness perspective is what we can notice and do now, because now is the moment that
That's
we
right.
have an opportunity to act.
Creating our future now.
That's right.
And that's really the point of mindfulness, isn't it?
Yeah. Now, a lot of discussion around compassion and empathy and subtleties between those.
Yeah, subtleties and perhaps not so subtleties. It's an important distinction, actually, and some learners really got it. Others found it quite challenging to really understand the distinction. I think the best way to think about it, Craig, is that empathy is when there are different types of empathy, but in general, it's when you understand or feel someone else's experience, and compassion is when you also do something to alleviate suffering. So if you experience someone experiencing distress or some kind of difficulty, you at least want to help or you do something to help. And that's really the key distinction. Activates different parts of the brain, tends to be a lot healthier for us over time.
But when there are times when perhaps you can't do anything to help, you could be seeing some suffering, on television,
Yes,
somebody somewhere in the world, and there's nothing you can immediately do.
No.
You can still feel compassion.
I think we can train ourselves to feel compassion, to make wishes at least. May that person experience less suffering. May they, may there be peace in the world, or even on the news to see the helpers, to look for the people that are helping, the people filming, the people exposing, the people who are pulling people out of the rubble. I think that's a very powerful practice in and of itself.
And I think compassion is a very natural consequence of a sense of oneness, a sense of real connection with somebody.
Right.
In the same way that we would wish ourselves well.
Yes.
We also wish well for others as well.
Yeah. Some of our learners noticed that they wanted to feel needed by others. There's almost a role that comes, isn't there, or an identity in a sense, a secondary sort of payoff. And I think that's really common, actually. And Craig, sometimes in my clinical practice as well, I notice that the clients I work with are often kind of burning out or getting resentful because they're doing too much for others and not taking care of themselves.
Yeah.
And so obviously once they realise that, they start to sort of focus more on what their own needs are and take better care of themselves. But initially there's sort of almost a resistance to that because it's like, well, hang on, I'm losing my identity here. I'm a carer, I'm a helper, that's what I do.
And I think from a mindfulness perspective, if somebody's in a caring role, and it can be pretty demanding, pretty challenging, but is that when we're away from that role, could be down the streets, could be having a meal or whatever, that we don't keep on ruminating and worrying about it. All the stuff that's gone on before, all the stuff we've got to do in the future, but just to be in the moment.
Yes.
So that we actually do get some mental and emotional clear air.
Yeah.
Because when we're caught up in the role, we're often ruminating way outside of and the rumination, the worrying about caring, doesn't provide any actual help.
That's
so
right.
We need to know how to let it go and just be present in simple moments in our life.
Yeah.
Yeah, so meditations on compassion as well, and people have found that they can be challenging, but they can certainly be quite liberating at the same time.
And it's just mental training. We're just practicing certain habits, which are actually innate qualities, compassion and love and mindfulness. But we can practice them and we just retrain the brain, and we find if we do the meditation, we're just going to find ourselves being more compassionate in day-to-day life.
And mind you, when we're ruminating on negativity and criticism and so on and anger, that's a form of meditation as well.
Practicing that criticism meditation, right?
Yeah, and it's quite powerful, and that has a different effect. At very least, even if we don't feel like we want to cultivate kindness or compassion to somebody, we could practice not cultivating the opposite of that.
Yes.
Anger and resentment, etc.
Yeah, that's
because that'll etch its way very deep.
And in meditation as well, when we try to practice compassion for difficult people, and we immediately often notice that contraction in our own body, which actually feels like a source of stress or suffering.
Well, that is a stress response.
And so it's important to notice that and see that we're actually creating problems for ourselves when we hold on to those grudges.
There's an interesting sort of discussion as well about the need to sometimes be assertive or to speak up. And being compassionate, does that mean that we don't? I think there's a kind of truthfulness, for example, to be authentic, to be honest, to be mindful, means to be truthful, but to do that in a way that is also considerate of others.
Yeah.
To not do it in a way that is has a kind of a harmful or malicious intent. So there's a kind of different sort of assertiveness, I think, that arises out of mindfulness and compassion.
Well, again, coming maybe from that sense of connection rather than a sense of wanting to distance yourself and perhaps sensing that connection, but also sensing that we don't want to harm ourselves, we don't want to let other people harm themselves. And so perhaps we act in a different way.
Yeah, and I think sometimes, for example, never having any boundaries or limits for a child that might need to learn boundaries and limits. But if those boundaries and limits are being clear, consistent and so on, but there's love behind it.
Yes.
It's for the care of the child. Because if we think that compassion is just, I don't want to, cause any upset. No, just do whatever they want.
Let them do what they want. It's definitely not compassion. That kid's not learning how to be in the world and they're going to suffer later on. So
that's right.
Compassion sometimes also about looking into the longer term and seeing what's best for people over time.
And I think even in the present moment, when we're not setting a boundary that we need to, for example, with a child, what we're actually not noticing is that maybe fear or aversion is the thing that's making us not set the boundary rather than actual compassion. Whereas sometimes to be firm but clear but compassionate keeps it certainly clearer for ourselves and for the child.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, so we've also, some of the learners as well with carers have been talking about the need for self-care as well.
Some of the learners who are carers for others. Yeah. It's so important, isn't it, that sort of analogy of being on a flight, and the oxygen mask drops, you put your own on first so that you've got some surplus and so that you can actually take care of other people in a sustainable way.
Yeah.
Because if we're just trying to fix them or help them or, giving too much of ourselves, we tend to burn out.
Yes, that's right. So there's been lots of interesting discussion this week, and I'm sure we'll continue next week as well. So cultivating compassion, emotional health, dealing with both emotional and physical pain.
Yes.
These are not easy topics.
They're not. They're quite challenging for a lot of people.
Yeah, and this is not an introductory course, really. And so go at your own pace. Support others in sharing on the discussion boards and so on. But go at your own pace. Trust yourself and practice the things you feel ready to.
That's right.
I mean, if you don't feel ready to practice something, then just wait and just give it time.
And you can always come back to it later on.
That's right.
Perhaps purchase an upgrade for the course so that you've got access to the materials all the time, so you can come back to it when you're ready.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. So we'll look forward to being with you next week and have a very mindful week between now and then.